We should have the chairs be closer. I mean, you guys are all way back there. It's like...
There you go. DJ will sit with you. Okay. Welcome to Elder Wisdom. It's our privilege today to talk with Gay Canough, longtime UUCB resident and our particle physicist. And I'm thinking not many UU congregations have such a person among them. We're very fortunate. Most of us know Gay as the founder and owner and operator of ETM Solar, a pioneer in solar electricity. And we know her as an active member of our congregation, and maybe most recently as an unsuccessful candidate for Town of Union supervisor. But that means she has more time to do other stuff that she's going to tell us about today. Recently retired. She's had a most interesting life, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, Gay, you were born in Grand Rapids and grew up in Fort Wayne, and the oldest of three sisters. What else can you tell us about your growing up, your family?
Okay, well, as some of you know, my mom was blind. She came here, I'm sure I brought her here a few times. She moved here in 2007. But growing up, you know, she was really, truly amazing, a truly amazing mom to be able to raise us. She did all the things a normal mom would do. You know, she raised us, she kept a household, she did all the cleaning and all the cooking and all this kind of stuff. And of course, she trained us. She trained us early. For example, I remember I was probably, I must have been 3 or 4 years old because we were living in Kalamazoo, and she was teaching us our letters. She had these magnetic, you know, the magnetic letters like you have on the fridge there, and that's what she used to teach us our letters. So, you know, so we went into kindergarten already knowing letters and knowing at least the bare bones of reading. So that was, I really appreciate what she did for us. Let's see, it said early education, all right. So yeah, so then when we moved to Fort Wayne, and we lived right outside of Fort Wayne, and a little later we moved a little east of there, and I went to school in New Haven, Indiana, which is on the east side of Fort Wayne. So yeah, that's kind of my really early life there.
Did you go all the way through high school in Fort Wayne?
Yeah, so all the way through high school, except I forgot to tell you this, Ann. I actually dropped out of high school.
No.
I left, yeah. I went 3 years, and I hated it, every minute of it. I did well in it, got all A's, but I could not stand the place, so the fourth year, there was this program that you could get high school credit so that you could graduate by taking a class at the local college. So I only needed like one class. So I took one class at the local college to get the final credit I needed for high school so I could graduate.
What was the class?
I think it was something like psychology or some random thing that sounded interesting at the time, that I took. So then I was able to graduate.
Well, I'm so relieved. At what age did you decide you wanted to be a physicist? Did that happen in high school or what?
That happened in 8th grade, 7th or 8th, it was probably 8th grade, when I started I was always interested in science. And of course, you guys know what a Trekkie I am. You know, Star Trek played a big role in getting me interested in science. But until middle school, I did not really know that you could actually be a scientist. You know, I mean, this is Podunk, Indiana. So I saw some other TV show that featured a physicist, and I thought, ooh, that sounds like a cool thing to be. So I go looking up, well, what do they do? And I said, oh, this is probably the thing you need to be in order to invent warp drive. No, really. That's what I thought.
Still working on that, right?
This is like 8th grade mentality, it's like, this is what I really thought. So I got involved in that. And I'd been involved in astronomy before that. I loved astronomy. And somehow I got wind of this thing called nuclear physics, which, instead of way out there in space, we're talking way down here, smaller and smaller. There's some inspiration there from, if you ever watched, there's a movie of it now. It's called The Fantastic Voyage by Isaac Asimov, right? Where people shrink down small enough that they can travel around in your bloodstream, right? So I thought, yeah, and you can shrink down even smaller than that, in your mind anyway. So I got really interested in that idea, and started reading up on that. And back then, I mean, in 8th grade, that was the good old days when I had a really, really good memory. I could read a book on anything and repeat it. Now, I didn't mean I understood it, but I read a lot of stuff, and over time started to understand it. So that's kind of how I got started in that.
What kind of encouragement did you get? If you decided in 8th grade you wanted to be a physicist and you're in podunk,
right?
What happens then?
Right. So that's when I the very first time I started to run into sort of the negativity that women have to face. And essentially everyone in my life discouraged this idea of being a physicist. They, the teachers, my friends, they're all like, yeah, girls don't do that. Girls can't do that. My parents were more along the lines of, how are you ever going to make money doing that? Why don't you be a veterinarian? They make money. So they weren't totally discouraging, but, they were pretty discouraging. So I remember, I think it was in 9th grade, I was talking to, I think it was like a teacher and maybe a friend about wanting to be a nuclear physicist. And their response to that was, girls can't do that. Why do you want to do that? And I said, well, it seems to me, by this time I had already read up on this a bit, I said, it seems to me the very first nuclear physicist was a woman. That would be Marie Curie, right? So they're like, yeah.
Who knew?
Okay. So I was not, a lot of times when girls get told they can't do something, they really get discouraged and they give up. And I learned this a lot later when I was running a summer science camp over at Binghamton University to encourage girls into science. That a lot of girls had been told they can't do that and they would get discouraged and give up. Me, I was like, the more people said it couldn't be done, the more I dug into it and said, I'm going to do it. And I just, roared forth and kept going, even though I had really no idea what I was getting into at that time. But
so I'm hearing you say that a lot of your science education did not come from your high school classes, but from your own reading.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, I only had 2 people in my life who actually encouraged me. One was my Girl Scout leader, and I gave a presentation at a Girl Scout event a few years ago about this, and pointed that out. My Girl Scout leader was like, yeah, go for it. And and then there was one other person, my science teacher in high school. He was a chemistry teacher, but he also taught physics because they didn't have a separate person to teach physics, and he didn't really like physics that much, but he got wind of the fact that I really liked physics. And so he would go out of his way to show cool videos about particle accelerators and stuff in class and encourage me. And after I went to college and graduated and things, I would still write to him and tell him, and thank him, because he was like the only teacher that ever encouraged me.
As a former teacher, I'll tell you that's really important to do,
Yeah.
to say thank you. You told me there wasn't a lot of money to send you to college, and yet you ended up at Purdue. How did that come about?
So yeah, that's when I was starting to think about college. If any of you are guidance counselors, please up your game. I think here it's better, but back in Podunk, Indiana, the guidance counselors, they had no idea. They didn't even know what physicists did or anything. They knew nothing. So they weren't very helpful, but somehow I got the idea in my head that I would like to go to Caltech. It's a good place for physics, right? But I quickly gave up that idea because, and this is where the guidance counselors could have been helpful, if they'd have, told me, yeah, you can if you do this, 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 and this. But our family really didn't have any money. There wasn't going to be money coming from my family to send me to college, and I knew that. And I got to thinking, well, I got to go to Caltech's in California, and it's going to be expensive, and so I kind of gave up on that idea prematurely, and decided I'm going to have to go to somewhere that I can afford. And at the time, in Indiana, Purdue University is a state school, which was very inexpensive. And this is in the late 70s. So in the late 70s, the tuition at Purdue was $360 a semester. Which in the late 70s was, probably equivalent to, a couple $1,000s nowadays. But it was affordable, and I could see how I could work and make enough money to actually go. So, so I signed up for that, and that wasn't super far away. That's down in Lafayette, Indiana. So it wasn't super far away from home either. But of course, my mom was very worried. How are you gonna, get a job and go to school? And I drove down to Lafayette, and I think on the first day I was there, I already had a job at some restaurant, Taco Bell or somewhere like that, and, and signed up for my schooling. Actually, the very first year I was able to go to where I had gone in high school, where they had a satellite campus of Purdue in Fort Wayne. So my first year I actually was able to go there, and then I had to go down to Lafayette. So I was so destitute as a student, though. There was one semester where I actually could not afford to go to school, so I had to just work and save my money. The upside of all this, though, so I worked about half time all the time I was in college, like about 20 hours a week, and making minimum wage, basically, making minimum wage. But I was able to live. I had apartment, or had lived in a house with some other people, so I could afford to do it. I couldn't afford to live on campus, but that was okay. However, what I couldn't afford to do was maybe enough studying to get super good grades, because I was always had to work at least half time to survive. But the upside of all that is when I got done, I didn't have any student debt.
Yeah, that's huge. So you worked your way through Purdue making tacos?
Well, my first year there, I worked at Taco Bell. In fact, there was times when I worked at 2 different Taco Bells, one on each side of town, in order to make enough money. But then the one I was working at, I was the only one at that point, they got a new manager. And the new manager decided to fire all of the existing employees because he wanted to hire his own group of employees. So, he wasn't telling us we were doing bad. He was just saying, you're all out of here because I'm going to hire my own people. Okay. Well, I was kind of distraught because I needed money. It's like my only means of sustaining myself. So my roommate at the time, she says, well, why don't you go over to the physics department and see if they got any jobs? So I go over there, and what did I do? I forget how I got an interview, because there was no online back then. We're still in the late 70s, right? I think what it is that she was working there, and she suggested, she told one of the professors that I was looking for a job, and I got in to talk to him. He only asked me one interview question. He says, so what's your major? I said, physics. He's like, you're hired. That was like the easiest interview ever. So the job was scanning bubble chamber film.
And that is?
And that's, they found out when in my quantum mechanics class, I got to look at some bubble chamber pictures. We would take, in particle physics, they would take literally millions of these pictures, and someone has to look at all those. So there'd be a team of people who looked at every single picture. So a bubble chamber, now they don't use these anymore. I didn't tell the class that. These are old tech. But have any ever built a cloud chamber in 8th grade science class?
Oh, sure.
Right? Some people have. That was a way of detecting cosmic rays where you put some super saturated air in, and you can see into anything that has a dark background. You can put it into a jar or anything, and super saturated with water, and when a cosmic ray goes through, it leaves a trail in there, and you can see it. So essentially forms, like a cloud, and water condenses when a cosmic ray goes through. So a bubble chamber is the same idea, except we're using liquid hydrogen, and we would compress it and then let the pressure up as soon as the particle goes in there from the beam, which in my case was mostly at Fermilab, where I did most of my work there, and there would be a trail of bubbles where a particle went through. So yes, you can actually take a picture of a subatomic particle in a bubble chamber, and you can see if it collided with one of the protons in the hydrogen and created more particles. You could see all those tracks coming off of there. So again, when I did my experiment in grad school, we had over 1 million pictures. Somebody's got to look at all those. And when I was an undergrad, there was other people doing experiments and sending us rolls of, this was back in the day of film, right? Big rolls of film from the experiment, and we had to literally look at every single picture. So I worked from 4 to midnight looking at bubble chamber film, and I think I still only made minimum wage. But then again, one semester I says, I need more money, so I had to take another job. So the bubble chamber pictures, that was for the high energy physics group, AKA particle physics group. The other job was for the nuclear physics group, which was the low energy physics group, okay? And that was running the particle accelerator downstairs in the basement. We had a Van de Graaff particle accelerator at Purdue, and I knew about it, and I very carefully waited until the guy that ran it quit. I knew it was always run by students, so he was like going to be done with his schooling and he was going to leave. And I tracked that, and I knew that. And then as soon as he did, I went down and talked to the guy. I says, can I run the particle accelerator? He's like, you're hired.
Oh, jeez.
They were desperate. They were desperate for workers. So that was another job. So then at that time, by that time I'd gotten, I was like promoted from, instead of measuring the bubble chamber film, now I was helping build particle detectors, and that took place during the day. So in the summertime, I worked on that during the day, and in the evening, from 4 to midnight, I ran the particle accelerator downstairs. I loved both those jobs.
You went from Taco Bell to doing real physics.
Yeah. And the particle accelerator job was really great because usually I didn't have to do very much. I'd turn everything on, tune it up, bring up the voltage, and the experiment, the physicists set up the experiments at the end of the beam. So that was their job. We did a lot of, again, this was, we did a lot of work that wasn't physics work, it was just work to make a buck so that we could do physics work. We would analyze water for the EPA by shooting electrons at it and measuring X-rays to measure what was in the water. But occasionally, the physicists would have grant money to do real nuclear physics experiments, and for that we had to turn up the voltage. So anybody ever seen a Van de Graaff generator? It's got a metal ball at the top, right, and it's got a rubber band that goes in a tube, and it builds up charge up here, and when you touch that, your hair stands up. You remember that from school?
Oh, that's what that's called.
Yeah, a Van de Graaff generator. Well, this was the same thing, only a lot bigger. It was the size of this room. And the rubber band was this wide, and the metal ball was probably 6 feet in diameter. I mean, it was big. So we had, and it was all enclosed in a steel containment thing. So to do nuclear physics, we had to turn up the voltage to get higher energy particles down the machine, and the tech who maintained it, he says to me, okay, we're going to turn the voltage up, and he says, now don't get scared if there's a spark between the dome and the container. So, well, how will I know if there's a spark? He says, oh, you'll know. So me, I'm a punky undergraduate. I'm sitting there turning up the voltage. We had a little crank to turn the voltage up, and all of a sudden there's like, blam! I mean, like a bomb went off. And I'm like, what the heck? Oh, that was a spark.
Well, that sounds exciting. So after Purdue, where you had some amazing experiences, you went to Notre Dame. How did that come about?
So I have a Bachelor's of Science in Physics from Purdue, and then I wanted to go to graduate school. So I started applying to graduate schools, and I worked, while I was at Purdue, I did work with a particle physics group for probably at least a year. I did things like, while I was at Purdue, one summer I went to the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. And, particle physics has big groups of people that work on it for experimental work. So I was doing experimental work. Typical group would have 30 or 40 people in it. So I knew a lot of other particle physicists, and some of them were at U of Notre Dame. So when I applied to graduate school, I actually got accepted at Ohio State and U of Notre Dame, and the guys at U of Notre Dame, they recruited me. They wanted me, because they wanted me to come up and work with them. So, and the other thing is that at the time, U of Notre Dame was small. It was a lot smaller than it is now. Now it's gotten really big. And Purdue was huge. And I wasn't so keen on huge. When you go to a huge state school, it's basically they take everybody and then they try to flunk people out, which was, that was not very pleasing. So I chose Notre Dame and went up there. But again, because I missed that one semester because I couldn't afford it, I was now half a year off in my schedule. So in that intervening 9 months before I went to grad school, I took a job at U of Michigan, and in their particle physics group, and I built particle detectors. One of which went to, we went to Stanford again. So Stanford Linear Accelerator, also known as SLAC. I had been there a couple of summers, and that's not quite where Larry comes in, but only in the entangled quantum sense he comes in, so the experiment that I was building detectors for involved a humongous superconducting magnet. And this magnet, it was so big, it was at Argonne National Lab, and it was going to be transported to Stanford. In order to transport it, they had to have this truck, this fancy truck that I think they built for it. This truck had 100 wheels.
Good grief.
And they had to get permits from all the states to drive this heavy thing over their roads to get it to Stanford. And at that time, Larry was working at Argonne National Lab. Now, I didn't know him, but he was watching them load this magnet, and everybody's oohing and eyeing about getting this huge thing on this huge truck. He was there at Argonne, and I was at SLAC to receive this thing, and I had lots of pictures of this huge truck. So that was, that was our first indirect connection.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I ended up then going to starting at U of Notre Dame in there, and I started in their nuclear physics group, but because I really thought I wanted to study like nuclear reactions of the sun and things like that, which I did. But the people in the group, this is another story that keeps coming up in physics and everywhere else for women. Back then, there was maybe 5% of physicists were women. And so, I was always the only woman amongst a bunch of guys. And then, you've all seen The Big Bang Theory. You know how immature male physicists are.
So it's really like
that.
They
were really like that, man.
Oh, my goodness.
So I don't know. It was not, I wasn't really happy in that group, and so then I went to the high energy physics group, or particle physics. back then, since they were high energy physics, I called us the HEP cats. We were HEP, we were high energy physicists, HEP cats. So, of course, I knew some of them, again, because I'd worked with some of them before. So I went upstairs from the basement, I went upstairs to the high energy physics group and started working there.
So how long were you at Notre Dame?
Well, I was there, let's see, it was probably about 6 years. You know, I wanted to get my PhD. The first 2 years is a lot of classroom stuff, and then you have to take a qualifying exam. And if you pass that, then you can start doing a lot on research for a PhD. And for particle physics, this is, it's longer than a lot of other kinds of things that you get a PhD for, because we were building a large particle detector. I mean, the particle detector system that we built for the experiment that I was going to work on was the size of a football field. And it was made of a whole bunch of different things. And the collaboration was about, I don't know, 30 to 40 people from different universities. You know, and then I had my one box that I built. I built a Cherenkov counter for that big system of detectors. So, you know, all this takes time. So you have to come up with your idea, obviously, for your experiment. Now you got to go get grant money. I made a few jokes about this in class, about, you know, getting grant money. That takes time, because these things aren't cheap. So you got to get your grant money, then you got to build it, and you're working with all these other people, so there's all this coordination you got to do and get everything together at your experimental site. And where I worked was at Fermilab outside of Chicago. So, you know, we had to build all that and tune it up, you know, so then we had thousands and thousands of high voltage wires and wire chambers that all had to be calibrated and tested and make sure everything works. And my box, I had this huge wall of mirrors and photomultiplier tubes and wires coming out of that, and I had to calibrate that, and et cetera. So all this stuff takes a lot of time. And then we got to call up the control room at Fermilab and say, send us beam. Okay. So
What did that mean?
So that means they're going to fire up the accelerator and send 800 giga-electron volt protons down to our experiment. The Fermilab accelerator is 4 miles in circumference. So you could go on a nice jog around that thing. It was so big that in the middle of it, they had the Prairie Preservation Project, where they were growing prairie grasses and raising buffalo in the middle on the top. So the ring itself is all buried underground, ring of magnets to accelerate your protons. So one day I was tuning something up out in the experiment, and I hear over the loudspeaker, the beam is going to come on. And I'm like, no, wait! I'm hanging upside down with my screwdriver adjusting something. I'm like, wait, don't turn the beam on while I'm in here.
Oh, gosh. Apparently you escaped.
Well, yeah, it's really not, it really probably wouldn't hurt me. You know, it sounds impressive, but it's not a lot of particles. You know, it is high energy, but it's not a lot of particles. So it's not like I'm going to get irradiated and die. But we weren't supposed to be in there when the beam's on. So then we ran that experiment. I think we ran it day and night. I usually worked the Foard, from midnight to 8 a.m. That was a shift I chose because everybody else wanted to rotate shifts. They wanted to change shifts from one day to the next. I could not do that. I couldn't stay awake and do that. So I said, I'll take the late shift. I'll take the midnight to 8 every time. So that was kind of hard because I couldn't sleep all day.
Yeah.
You know, I just couldn't do it. I'd go home, I'd sleep for 4 hours, I'd get up, I'd do stuff, and then I'd sleep for a couple more hours before going on shift. But we probably ran for, I want to say, somewhere between probably at least 6 months of run time to get 1.1 million bubble chamber pictures and all the data from the wire chambers that went with them. Well, then we got to analyze all that. So you're starting to see why this takes 6 years.
Yeah.
It takes 6 years to get a PhD in particle physics. We had to analyze all that data. I had to take those 1 million events. I was looking for charmed D mesons. Those are mesons that have a charm cork and some other kind. So I was looking for those, and they had a specific way they decayed in the bubble chamber. So I had to whittle all those pictures down to, I whittled 1.1 million pictures down to 40 good ones.
Wow.
Then I had to do some calculations on those to understand what product of the decays came off of that to to figure out what. And finally I asked my, there's lots of things you can then do with that data. So I asked a couple of people, not my advisor, he was kind of useless, but some of the postdocs. I said, so what should I do for my thesis that won't take too long to do? And he says, calculate the lifetime of the D meson. I said, okay. So that's what I did. And it didn't take too long. But it still took, I don't know, I probably still spent another 6 months doing that. And then I had to write it all up. Writing it all up, that only took maybe a month, if that, because I'd already written a paper about the Cherenkov counter that I built, and I'm the kind of writer that once I know what I'm going to write, it just spills all out, like instantly and quickly. And I wrote it in the narrative style because I had written a lot of science fiction stories before that. And some of the guys that were on the committee that were going to read it were very, they were very negative about that. They're like, you can't write like that. You have to write science things in third person, impersonal.
Yeah. Academic discourse.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But then a couple of them were like, we love this because you know what? We can understand what you're saying.
What a concept.
What a concept.
When we were talking, you used the phrase bonkers with enthusiasm. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, yeah, you can tell I am, right? I still am, right? I still love physics. But not everybody appreciated that, and there was, I would just get so excited I couldn't contain myself. I'd be like, I was a joyous physicist. But
that could be the name of your autobiography.
The Joyous Physicist. Right?
Yes.
Right. But I think some of the people that I had to deal with, they either what I did didn't translate into that for them, or they were jealous. And one time I was telling Ann this story about my advisor. One time takes me aside and he says to me, he says, well, I don't think you're serious about physics. I almost punched him. I got so mad, and I jumped up and down and yelled at him. It's like, how dare you? I've been into this since I was in 8th grade. This is all I've ever wanted, and I really went off on him. And honestly, I don't think it was until you actually asked me this that I actually truly internalized what was going on. And what was going on was that he thought that he was wasting his time on a woman who was just going to get married and leave, and not do physics.
It's an old story.
Right? I mean, that's so typical. And I remember having lots of conversations with my collaborators at Fermilab, and it was just, I don't know, it wasn't, they just didn't take me seriously. In fact, I told Ann this story of, I was at Fermilab at they had a little pub on site where all the physicists hung out in the evening for happy hour. So I'm in there one day, and I see a famous physicist sitting at the bar. And I think, oh, I'm going to go sit next to him, and I'm going to ask him about gauge theory, which he was an expert in, and I was trying to learn. And I was so excited. I was like beside myself. So I go and I sit next to him, and he starts chatting me up. And what he wants to do, at one point we get, we stepped away from the pub, or from the bar to talk, and he is flirting, and he's trying to get me to go back to his apartment there at Fermilab to, hit the sack, right? I was so mad. I got so mad. I was like this, nose to nose with this guy. And I'm thinking to myself, don't hit the famous physicist. And I just walked away. But I think that was the moment my bubble was truly popped there about, the collegiality. There was no collegiality that I had expected with my fellow physicists. It was very disappointing.
Well, isn't it interesting that as a woman scientist, you had to add that onto all the other stuff you were doing?
Yeah. In fact, there was so much of that. There was so much of that. I could write a book about that. And ultimately, that fed into why I didn't stick with particle physics for a career, because I was fully intending to do that. That was my heart's desire, and I went, when I graduated when I got my PhD and all that, I was ecstatic, and I went and I applied for jobs at universities that were doing experiments, some of which I knew what they were doing, and I knew the people there, and I thought, I applied for this one that I thought, this is perfect. It was at Indiana University. I knew the people, I knew the experiment, I knew I could fit right in and contribute, and I knew it was all going to be great. So I go down there for an interview. And the guy I interviewed with, the professor, he wanted me to be his girlfriend and go to do this experiment in Italy. And at that point, I was engaged to Larry. And so, again, I was like, that was like the last straw. And that's when I said, okay, I'm going to apply for jobs somewhere else besides in physics.
And here you are. Well, you've mentioned Larry a couple times now. Let's talk about how that came about.
So I met Larry at U of Notre Dame. As you may know, Notre Dame it's a Catholic-oriented school. I was not Catholic, but Larry is. Larry was Catholic. And he was studying in the metallurgy, which is now more generally material science. So he was at Notre Dame, and one day, this was probably in the 82 time frame, I was moping about in my graduate student housing room, thinking, how am I ever going to find a guy? What guy's going to want a female nuclear physicist?
I think they'd be lining up.
So I thought, I was like giving up. I said, oh, I'm not going to worry about that. Whatever. And I went to lunch at the cafeteria, which I did almost every day. Well, that day, I said, I'm going to sit with somebody I know. Usually I would just go there, pick a spot, any spot. So I'm going to sit with somebody I know. And I see a guy sitting there. His name is Shiva. He was a graduate student in the metallurgy department. And I also knew him because he was the boyfriend of one of my roommates. And he's a very outgoing guy. He was one of those kind of guys that he knew everybody and everybody knew him, and very outgoing. He was at all the cool parties. So I said, I think I'll sit with Shiva. So Shiva, it turned out Larry was having the exact same lament in his office in the metallurgy department, like, how am I ever going to meet a woman? I think I'll go to lunch with Shiva. So Larry's sitting there with Shiva, and Shiva introduces us. Now keep in mind, Shiva's the conversationalist. Larry and I are both kind of introverted, quiet people at the time. But Larry and I get to talking, and in less than 2 minutes, we had cut Shiva out of the conversation. And both of us knew immediately that this was something else. Something was up, and that he might be the one, she might be the one. We knew that, like, right off the bat. But we didn't take all the necessary actions, like getting each other's phone number. This is the days before cell phones, too, so there's that. So we went our separate ways, and we proceeded to think about each other all week. And the next time I saw Larry in the cafeteria, I sat with him. So that was the next time I was able to meet with him. Saw him in the cafeteria. I kept going back every day.
Like you would.
And I sit down with him, and we start talking, and that day, someone had stolen my bicycle. And I was, back then, that was my transportation. So I start lamenting that someone had stolen my bicycle, and Larry says, oh, I got an extra bicycle that I'm not using. You can have it. I'm like, really? You're going to give me a bicycle? Oh. So I went to visit him over at his apartment, and he had this French racing bike that had an aluminum frame. I mean, this was like a fancy bike, but one of the pedals was broken off of it. But he was going to give it to me. He says, all we got to do is go over to the bike shop and see if they can put a new pedal on. Okay, great. It was so lightweight, I could carry it up to my apartment, so it wasn't going to get stolen. So we go over to the bike shop. It cost $6 to get a new pedal on this bike that probably cost him, I don't know, it was probably, back then, I bet you it was a few $100 for this fancy bike. And then that was the beginning of the bicycle romance. Because then he started inviting me, said, well, you want to go bike up to the ice cream shop? Before that, bicycling was just transportation to me. But he was really into the sort of the joyriding kind of bicycling. So let's go to the ice cream shop. Where's that? Oh, that's up here. It's in Michigan. Notre Dame is in South Bend, Indiana, right? Well, oh, okay. How far is that? It wasn't super far. I mean, it's probably 15 miles to ride up there. So we started doing that, and that one thing led to another, and ultimately, we went on, I think our longest ride we did was from South Bend to Traverse City, Michigan, which took like 5 days. Back then, there was no trails either, so.
So Larry was still in school at that point, right?
Yeah, so he was working on his PhD in metallurgy. And he had kind of finished in, I think it was 82, 83. We'd been hanging out for about, I don't know, a year or so. And he ran out of funding for whatever he was doing, but he'd done all his data now. He'd gathered all his data, so he had all the data. He just had to work on his thesis. But he didn't have any more funding to stay there, so he took a job at IBM. He came out here. And then sometime before he left, we got engaged. In fact, the way that all went down was one day, he was like really skinny guy when I met him. He weighed 148 pounds and he was 6'1".
Wow.
Too skinny. So, and he was having low blood sugar problems and stuff. And so one day we're going out to dinner or something and talking about whatever we were talking about, and food, we're talking about food, and he was lamenting that he's having this problem with his blood sugar, and I says, well, Larry, I gotta fatten you up. And he says, the first woman that fattens me up, I'm gonna marry. 6 months later, he weighed 170 pounds. I said, well, Larry, I guess we gotta go ring shopping, right? But before he came out here, he actually proposed and we got engaged. But we knew it was going to take me a while longer yet, because I didn't finish my stuff till 87. So we had a long distance relationship. And I would drive out here 1 month, the next month he would usually either drive or fly out back to South Bend. We talked on the phone like for hours. And
that's when there was long distance, right?
Right, and this is on the landline, right, which we spent a fortune talking on the phone for hours. And when we finally, the day after we got married in 1987 was the day the stock market crashed, and we said, this is probably because we stopped talking on the phone. And so the stock price of the phone company crashed, and then everything went down with it.
So you got married in...
So we got married at Notre Dame in their church. They have a really, really beautiful little church on the campus. I had to reserve that church a year ahead. That's how our date got determined that we were going to get married. I went to the church and I said, when's the first date we could have a wedding in the church? And they named a date that was a year in the future. I said, I'll take it. Cost $50. And one of our fellow graduate students who was a priest, and he actually married us.
So after that, you came here, right, with Larry?
The first year after we were married, he actually took a leave of absence from IBM and came back to South Bend and worked as a postdoc while I worked as a faculty fellow for a year after I got my degree. And then we decided to come back here. We decided to come back to IBM. I had applied for jobs at various other places, but ultimately I said, well, he's at IBM, I'll apply for a job at IBM. So I applied for a job at IBM, and ultimately I came out here, did an interview. I remember the guy that interviewed me said, well, you're a physicist, you're a particle physicist. I mean, like, why should we hire you? Like, what can you do? And I said, oh, I can do anything. I actually said that to his face, and he was really impressed that I had that much chutzpah. And so he hired me. So then we both worked at IBM, and I hated it. I only lasted a year and a half, and at Larry, he worked there for 16 years, though, and he won awards and got patents and all kinds of great stuff.
And so you quit at IBM, then what?
So I quit IBM, and I quit because at IBM, the way you work your way up is you do a project and you get recognition from your manager, and you get recognition from your manager's manager, and then they give you, then they give you more projects and they give you a raise, and this is how you get promoted at IBM. But for me, because I was a woman, again, this is another problem, I would do a project and I'd make really good progress on it, and my manager would take it away from me and give it to a guy. So this first couple of times this happened, I'm like, well, I'm new, what do I know? The 7th time this happened, I pulled out a nice white piece of paper with nothing on it, and I wrote, I quit in the middle of it, and I put it on his desk and I left. Well, then I had to have another job, right? I needed a job. See, this would have been, well, in the meantime, before that, before we actually left South Bend, we had started a company, and it was called Extraterrestrial Materials. And this was a company that was going to mine asteroids to bring the riches of near-Earth space down to Earth. There's an asteroid that crosses the Earth's orbit. So this is not one that's way out there between Mars and Jupiter. It's not that. It's close. It crosses the Earth's orbit all the time. It's going to hit us one of these days. But it has $11 trillion worth of metal in it. Gold, platinum, silver. So we were going to mine one of those things. So hence, extraterrestrial materials. So we had started that, and we were doing that on the side. In fact, while I was still working at IBM, we started the Lunar Prospector Project, which was a design of a small lunar probe to look for ice at the poles of the moon. And we had a tiny, tiny grant from the Space Studies Institute to pull together scientists from all over the country and engineers to decide what we wanted to do and design the thing. And in order to recruit the engineers and scientists, I was going on the weekend to visit them, and they all lived in California. So I was flying out to the Jet Propulsion Lab and U of California at San Diego to visit, lunar scientists to recruit them. So we had started that, and that was kind of like on the side. So when I quit IBM, then I started doing that in earnest, a little bit more in earnest, and I also took a job as an adjunct over at Binghamton U teaching physics.
I'm trying to get my mind around a lunar probe as a side hustle.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay, well then moving on. How did that end up being the ETM that we know?
So I would call what we did in the beginning aerospace consulting. You know, we did a program about, you know, where we analyzed all the space debris, and we wrote a paper about all the space debris that's up there. I taught at the International Space University, which is a summer program for people involved in different space programs. You know, I taught things like space manufacturing and things like that. And then there's the Lunar Prospector Project, which is really kind of our main claim to fame, because it actually did go to the moon in 1998, and it did find ice at the poles. And there was another probe that went that confirmed that later on. So that was our thing in the aerospace. But in early 90s, we got a job, and I keep saying we. Well, Larry was he was working full-time at IBM, so most of the work was done by me, but of course, he was kind of supporting us because ETM started in 1988, but it didn't actually make enough money to pay myself a paycheck until 1999. And I know this because I still have the first paycheck taped to my wall in my home office from 1999. So he was supporting us, and I was, doing the space stuff. So I got a tiny little contract from NASA. I think my income from the aerospace was probably less than $20,000 a year in contracts that we did. So I got this tiny little contract from NASA, but I loved doing it because I got to do this stuff. And I got to go to one of the NASA sites and sit down with a group of people. And my job, what we were talking about was space solar power. Now, space solar power is the idea of putting a large solar array in geosynchronous orbit where you get sun 24 hours a day and beaming the power back to Earth with wireless power transmission. And that was, the technology for that had already been developed in the 60s. So we already had the means to do that. And what we were doing was looking at sort of an update of, well, is it economically feasible to do this now or not? The primary difficulty with doing it is we had lousy space transportation infrastructure, and we still do not have very good space transportation infrastructure, right? SpaceX is kind of the only company that's really, what I would say, doing it right. They're really doing it and really advancing the art. We need more. We need more. And still, SpaceX, they go to LEO, low Earth orbit, where the space station is. They don't go to GEO. GEO is a lot farther away. It's geosynchronous orbit. Communication satellites go up there to GEO, because at GEO you can point to one place on Earth all day. It doesn't move with respect to the Earth. It's orbiting, but it's looking at the same place on Earth all the time. So that's what we would need for space solar power. Well, part of my job in this group of people was to look at the issue of when do we need space solar power versus, say, terrestrial solar power. Is there some reason why we can't just put up solar panels on Earth versus space? And well, one reason is that at GEO you get sun 24 hours a day, so that's a good reason to do it. But the other question was, do we have enough physical space on Earth to do Earth-based solar power in a sort of realistic way, or we really need to put some in space? So what I've discovered in my little study was that there was only one place on Earth that did not have enough roof space for terrestrial solar power to power the load under it, and that was Manhattan. One place. Now, there's a couple more places now because some cities have built some really tall buildings with a big load under it, but then I also figured out, and people had already figured this out, so I did do calculations from first principles, because that's what I always do first, because I'm a physicist. But I did find out that other people knew this already, and that in fact, if you wanted to power the entire United States of America with Earth-based solar panels, you would only need 12,000 square kilometers, which is the size of the Nevada test site and range. So you do not need a huge amount of space to power everything with Earth-based solar power. So I got to thinking, I said, well, before I go to all the trouble to go to GEO, how's about we try terrestrial solar power instead of extraterrestrial solar power? Because you know what? And when it comes to the resources of space, solar energy is one thing that comes to you, that you don't have to go into space to get it. So I just went out on a lark and said, well, let's see if I can get any customers. I don't know what gets into me. I have to be careful. I have to be careful about this nowadays, you know, because it's easier to hurt yourself when you get older, you know.
You mean climbing up on roofs and installing solar panels?
Right. But then I'm like, this is in like 93, and they were, a friend of mine was involved in building the solar array up at Copernic. If you've ever been up there, they got a 4 kilowatt solar array up there, which is approximately twice as big, no, it's more than twice as big as a 4 kilowatt solar array would be today. But I went up there, I knew about this, and I went up there, and there's, you know, they had some people that were building it, and I just jumped right in. I said, I'm a volunteer, can I help? Like we were saying today, can I help? I can help. So I just helped, you know, started helping them get the wiring done and putting the panels on the rack and all that good stuff. And then the next year, I start getting serious about business. Okay, how am I going to get a customer? So I paid $12 a month to have an ad in the Penny Saver for solar power, solar electricity. So this is kind of solar hot water heating, which was a different kind of technology, had kind of petered out in the late 80s, early 90s. And essentially nobody was doing solar electricity because photovoltaics, which convert light to electricity, were very, very expensive. You know, a typical solar panel, a 75-watt solar panel, was $700 or $800. You know, it was really expensive. However, people answered my ad in the Penny Saver and said, yes, we need some electricity. And those people had camps and cabins or remote homes where they did not have utility power. And they had called up the utility to get line extension, and line extension cost tens of thousands of dollars, if they could get it at all, because you have to get permission from all your neighbors to have a line crossing their property to your house or your cabin. So the very first one I did, we put up 4 60-watt panels, batteries, and inverter on a cabin out in Deposit. I called Larry to help me on the weekend, took time off from IBM to help me do something that I needed 2 people for. You know, I couldn't do by myself. I think it was probably putting the rack up on the roof. I bought a kit from a company that sold solar equipment up in Vermont somewhere. Actually it was free, I got a paper book from Sandia National Lab called How to Install Residential Photovoltaics. And I read it, and I was just so dingy. You know, I just said, hey, I know how to do DC. When I did particle detectors, they were all DC, direct current, electricity. It's, but a particle detector has 4,000 volt wires and 300 milliamp currents, thousands of an amp, okay? DC solar electricity has 12 volts or 24 volts DC and 300 amps coming down a wire this big around. But I said, this DC, I can,
Yeah, how hard can it be?
How hard can it be? Well, I ultimately decided to stick with terrestrial solar because when we got done with that very first project, the customer, it was dusk, and the customer goes into their cabin and they turn on the switch and they have lights. And they came out in the yard and they danced because they had electricity. Oh man, they were so happy to have electricity. And I said, well, this is satisfying. And it's a lot more satisfying than, because even though it took us a few days to install that, it was still a lot quicker than doing anything in space. I mean, we designed the Lunar Prospector in 1989, and it went to the moon 10 years later. It took 10 years to get grant money and Lockheed built it, and then NASA launched it, and that was kind of typical of aerospace. So here I could do something in a few days, and it's done.
So the rest is history.
So yeah, so then And of course, it was much cheaper. I think they were looking at $17,000 for line extension, and they could not get permission from their neighbors to run the line, and their solar electric system cost $5,000. So
A bargain.
it was a winner. Then they told all their neighbors. So we started to get more customers. And at that time, it was all off-grid. There was no grid connection stuff until the year 2000, actually.
We're getting on in time here, so can you describe briefly how that solar thing became important, not only in your life, but in the larger community?
Yeah. In the beginning, it was a business. It was fun. It was satisfying to build something and have it work and please the customers. And over time, I started to learn about the need for renewable energy in general. You know, I'm a founding member of the New York Solar Energy Industries Association. And when I started, I was literally the only installer in upstate New York. But I ran into a couple other people who had done solar hot water heating. One of them I got real excited about. He lived in South New Berlin. He got very excited about solar electricity, and he started doing that. We founded, like four or five other guys, founded the Industry Association in 1994. That was the same year NYSERDA got started under Governor Pataki. And we started, got wind of this idea of net metering for grid-connected systems. But I gradually, then I got we got some grant money, the Industry Association got some grant money to design a class to get other installers. You know, we wanted to train other installers. And we get all done, this is like in 98, 99, we get all done putting this together. It's like, okay, what are we gonna do now? We got this curriculum, what are we gonna do? I said, well, why don't we run this class? I'll do it. Okay, so the first class was held in my basement in the year 2000, in July, and 17 people showed up. They want to learn how to install solar electricity. I then proceeded to run that class over 250 times over 18 years, and I ran it in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and we grew the installer base. Last year I went to the Industry Association conference, and there were 800 people in the room. Wow. And I said, my job here is done. But the industry, it really started to jam. I think it was probably in 2000 and somewhere in around probably 2005, 2007, somewhere in there. I started to really get that burn for, you know, we got to make this transition to renewable energy. I started to understand what was going on with fossil fuels and climate change and all that stuff, and started to push a lot harder on that idea. I would always indoctrinate my class at the beginning, you know, by showing Al Gore's slides of, you know, from the Inconvenient Truth, which I had because I took his training down in Tennessee at one point. So I think it was in 2013, 14, somewhere in there, the Chinese jumped into manufacturing of solar panels, and the costs just dropped like a rock. I used to say in my class really early on, I say, you know, someday solar panels are going to be cheap as dirt, because you know what? They're made out of dirt. They're made of silicon, which is, sand is made of silicon dioxide, right? So they're going to be cheap as dirt. And when I started, they were like, we were talking like $10 a watt. So that's why my 75-watt panel was $750, right? Well, today, I looked last week, and the cost was down to 32 cents a watt.
Wow.
So the costs started just for mass production. You know, we didn't necessarily have to invent new technology, just had to mass produce the things. So the industry really expanded dramatically starting, you know, after 2010. It really, and so now we've gone from, when I started, there was 0.001 gigawatts of solar installed in the United States, and last year is up to 209.
And growing.
And growing. And I thought, we're hot stuff. And then I looked at what China's doing. China's going to install that much. That took us 40 years to get there. They're going to install that much in the next 2 years.
Well, they're building on your legacy. It's clear that you and Larry were soulmates. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of his illness and death, that was happening about the time I came into the congregation?
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, so Larry worked at IBM for 16 years. In 2000, they closed the plant in Endicott, and they told him, well, you can still have a job, but you got to move to Poughkeepsie. And he said, no, I'm not moving to Poughkeepsie. But at the time, so I had been, that was in like 2000, 2001, I had been teaching physics at Binghamton U. I had to stop doing that because my business got busy enough where I couldn't, and I had to focus on my business. He got a job at the physics department when he instead of moving to Poughkeepsie. So he quit IBM, got a job at the physics department, so he switched places. I became the corporate weenie, and he became the academic. We had been reversed before. So, that persisted. He worked at the university in the physics department for a couple, 3 years, like part-time. And then because that was the best thing that actually ever happened to ETM, because when he left IBM, I said, oh my God, we got to make money now. So I think the year after that was the first year we actually turned a profit. I buckled down and said, okay, we have to make money. Because he had supported us all this time, the second year we made money, I had put enough money aside to pay off the mortgage to the house with ETM profit. And at Christmas time, I gave him the receipt of the paid off mortgage. And he was just like, he was stunned. So he ultimately took over the lab there they were building a new lab at Binghamton U, and he was in charge of getting the equipment to build that lab. He comes home one day, he says, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I got $20 million to spend. How am I going to spend all this money? And I'm like, I have no sympathy. It's $20 million. But it was hard because, you have to put things out to bid and he had to spec all this fancy equipment and put it out to bid. But he got it done in 2 years. And then he was the director of that lab till the day he died. I mean, he was not going to quit working. He was already past 65 when he was diagnosed with cancer in 2018, and he just kept working. He wasn't going to retire. He loved his work, and he was really good at it, and everybody loved him. So he kept working, and he had to do all the things. He had esophageal cancer. It was already at stage 4 when they diagnosed it. So all they could really do is like the chemo thing and keep him alive for a little longer. But his doctor, I got to give his doctor credit, they kept him going for more than a year. In 2019, in the beginning of the year, we wanted to keep bicycling. We were still bicycling. I bought him an electric assist bike so that even though he was doing chemo, so he wouldn't get too tired if we kept bicycling. And we kept bicycling. We bicycled all summer in 2019. All over the place. I think our last bicycle trip was in September of 2019. We were up on the Gay Canough, biking away over Labor Day, and he passed away in December of 2019. So, he took it with such grace. I mean, that's really hard when somebody tells you you're going to die in a few months or a year, right? I mean, that's really hard. So. But he never complained. He actually worked up until probably the last 6 months. Then he just couldn't anymore. And now there's a plaque dedicated to him on the door of the lab at Binghamton U. He's the founder of the lab. So, and of course it was hard for me because Larry was my best friend. He was the love of my life. He's the one and only. He's still here. Every time I'm bicycling, I feel him, behind me, like up there, looking over my shoulder. And it's still hard. It's funny, after a while, after it's been, 5 years already, and I still, every now and then, I just tear up.
That's the cosmic entanglement?
Right. Quantum entanglement. We're definitely that.
On a completely different, well, maybe not so different. What brought you to Unitarian Universalism? And with all that other stuff going on in your life, why have you stayed?
Well, what got me here was easy. In '93, Larry and I, we had no family out here. And we had Alex, our son Alex, was like 3 years old. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know, we don't really know anybody in this community. And the other factor was that when I was a kid, I didn't go to any, my parents didn't do any religion at all. And so I didn't know thing one about religion. You know, I remember in 4th grade talking to a group of friends and they're talking about God and they're asking me what I believe in. And I said, well, I don't even know what that is. You know, I didn't know anything. So I thought, well, maybe I should get my son some religious education. Our neighbors went to this church, neighbors a couple streets up that we hung out with a little bit. And they talked about the religious education here as being really fantastic. They really loved it. They had a kid. And so we decided to try it out. So I come here, and the first thing I learned about was that UUs have like principles, and they have these 7 principles, and they read them off, and I said, wow, this sounds a lot like Starfleet. Principles. I have like prime directives and things, right? That's really what I thought. I'm weird, I know.
Whatever it takes.
So we kept coming here, and Alex, you know, we got him into the religious education, and that was good for him, and he enjoyed that, and we enjoyed the people here. You know, we had just a lot of like-minded people here, and a lot of Trekkies. You know. I don't know, like the music. So I was in choir back then too. I think what made me stay, and this is something for the outreach committee and the membership committee to think about. The reason I stayed is really, I mean, one of the key things was somebody asked me to do something and let me do it. So since at that time I was a contractor, somebody from the property committee needed something done, and they asked me if I'd join the property committee and help them with this thing, and I said yes. So then I was like involved in things, and I got more involved in more things. I joined the choir at one point. So yeah, involvement. I think that's really key to keeping people. Once people come and get them here, you got to involve them in things, and not just in words either. You got to really let them do stuff. I think sometimes we make this mistake of asking someone to do stuff, and then we micromanage them, and then it drives them away. So got to let it actually do stuff.
We're glad you're here. Is there anything you'd like to share at the end, Gay, that we haven't covered?
So I wanted to, since this is called Elder Wisdom, I thought I'd give you some words of wisdom here that I wrote down.
Get your pen and paper out. Here we go.
This is on the test. All right. This is my number one rule in life. Be persistent. Persistence always prevails. Do not give up. This is what I tell kids nowadays. I'm going to talk to the Girl Scouts sometime in February, and I'll be telling them that. Now that I'm a little older, pace yourself.
Like you did.
Pace yourself. But in the earlier days, what that meant was that, okay, you think one person can't make a difference? Okay, it took a while. It took 20 years. But what I did in solar was a big part of the growth of the solar industry in New York. Just what I did. And the way you pace yourself is you push as hard as you can push, but not so hard that you're going to hurt yourself. And you just keep pushing. Just keep doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it. And it'll happen. Another thing I've learned as I got older is to try and not worry so much. I'm still working on this one. I know I gotta cut this out. You know, stop making a mountain out of a molehill. But also don't stop doing things just because you can't do one particular thing. You know, so like I used to hike a lot. I used to backpack. I used to do all that stuff. I can't hike, but I can still bike. So I keep doing that. I can't do an all-day class anymore like I used to, but I can do a 2-hour class. Okay, so I can do that. I'm not going to be running any experiments at Fermilab again, probably, but I can still do theoretical physics. So this is what I'm working on now. Because I don't need a lot of grant money. I don't have to have a job. All I need is my home office, my computer, and if I really want to calculate something, I can use Mathematica, which is an online tool to calculate hard things to calculate. All right? So, do what you can do, and don't just sit. Don't listen to this other thing I'm going to tell girls. Do not listen to people telling you that what you cannot do. That's something girls need to hear all over the place, especially girls. So pretty much when I was young, I ignored that, but when people told me that, I still ignore that now. I'm sure that people look at me askance, especially other physicists, when I say, I'm going to do theoretical physics, and they're looking at me and they're like, you're 65 years old, you can't do theoretical physics. So yes, I can.
Just watch me, huh?
So there you go. There's some words of wisdom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
Are you willing to take any questions if anybody
Oh
has?
yeah, if anybody's still got any stamina left to
we ran late,
hang
but
here,
if anybody has a question, Gay's
happy
willing
to
to answer. I think they're thinking about football. Oh,
Okay.
So you hated high school. I hated high school. Both of you. When you went to do that one class at the college, was it like, oh, this is so different, this is all right, or did you not like that also?
so the question is, was that class she took in college, that first one, was that better than high school?
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, college is really a lot different, and you do still run in, especially when you're in the lower, when you're a freshman and sophomore in college, you still run into a lot of immaturity here and there, but mostly that's the other students. But it was definitely a lot better, bigger variety of people.
Any other questions?
Is there a point in your life that you said to yourself that I don't think I'm qualified to do this, or is it always been possible?
So he's asking if there was anything I thought that I maybe wasn't qualified to do, and I would say, yeah, running for office. I mean, I'm not a people person. I've become more of a people person because I had to, because I ran a business. I interacted with a lot of customers, but I am really, not a very good people person. So I recognize that, and I have to be careful about what I sign up for because of that. So.
I had the opportunity to observe her running for office very closely, and I want to say, even though she didn't win this last election, she had an impact, a very positive impact, that we'll be able to see. So if you get her started on a conversation about something she's passionate about when she's running for office, there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of moving things forward. That's right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This has been an interesting conversation. Thank you, Gay especially.
All right, thanks for putting up with me. All right.